You can support In the Past Lane by buying some of our merchandise. We've got merch with quotations from famous people in history, like Abraham Lincoln, fellow citizens, we cannot escape history, and Confucius, who said, "Study the past if you would control the future." And we've got some snarky ones too, like one of our bestsellers that says, "Dear America, okay, I'm begging you, stop repeating this shit." Signed, History. You can get these designs and many more on everything from a t-shirt or a hoodie to a coffee mug or a beach towel. Just go to our website, inthepastlane.com, and click on merchandise. Thanks.
We the people of the United States, in order to form a more
to huddled masses yearning to breathe free.
Consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill.
That all men and women are created equal.
Give me liberty or give me death.
Nobody's free until everybody's free.
And the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
Hi there. Welcome to In the Past Lane, the podcast about American history and why it matters. Brought to you by SBI, Snoring Beagle International, and coming to you from the Millionaire's Mile Studios, located in central Massachusetts. I'm your host, historian at large, Edward T. O'Donnell, and this is episode 186. Every week here at In the Past Lane, I tell you about the key things that happened this week in U.S. history, with special attention to one important story. So what's happening in the Past Lane this week? Well, spring is springing here in central Massachusetts, and that's always a welcome moment after a long winter. And this year it's even more welcome, as so many of us are basically confined to our houses and our backyards as we self-isolate during the COVID-19 crisis. I hope all of you are hanging in there, especially those of you who have lost your jobs or who work in the healthcare professions. As for me, this week I start teaching my classes remotely using Zoom, which suddenly it seems everyone's heard of. It allows for real-time live class sessions. I think I've mastered the technology, but the real test will be in those first few classes. I'll keep you posted. All right, let's get on with it. Here's what happened this week in American history. Let's start with this. On March 26, 1883, 137 years ago this week, Mrs. William K. Vanderbilt hosted a gala ball at her mansion on Fifth Avenue in New York City. There had been opulent balls and parties in New York City in the past, but nothing compared to this one. The event was held to celebrate the completion of the Vanderbilt's new mansion, which in truth was more of a palace in the style of Louis XIV than a mere mansion. And then there was the price tag for the ball, $250,000, or $6 million in today's money. The Vanderbilt Ball of 1883 announced a new era in the United States, one we now call the Gilded Age. And with this new era came new norms and values, ones that we're quite familiar with in the 21st century, but at the time were a sharp break from tradition. So who was Mrs. Vanderbilt, and what was she up to? Mrs. Vanderbilt was born Alva Erskine Smith in Alabama. She married William K. Vanderbilt, grandson of the Vanderbilt, that is, the great railroad magnate Cornelius Vanderbilt. Like his grandfather, he was one of the wealthiest men in America. It seemed that Alva Vanderbilt had it all. Well, not quite. People like the Vanderbilts had one problem. They had boatloads of money, but they had no elite heritage like the old money families, like the Astors and the Roosevelts. So one of Mrs. Vanderbilt's motivations behind her grand ball was to gain entry into elite society. The problem was that elite old money New Yorkers shunned the nouveau riche like the Vanderbilts. So Mrs. Vanderbilt worked up a plan. New York's high society was dominated by a woman named Mrs. Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, the self-proclaimed queen of the old money set. She had taken it upon herself to determine who was in and who was out in terms of society. And her confidant and consultant in this matter was a guy named Ward McAllister, who claimed that the true elite in New York only numbered 400. Mrs. Astor was especially determined to prevent the Vanderbilts from entering this inner circle. But then a crisis emerged. Carrie Astor, Mrs. Astor's daughter, did not receive an invitation to the Vanderbilt Ball, while all of her wealthy friends did. Alarmed over the implications of this snub, Mrs. Astor made some discreet inquiries. It turned out that Mrs. Vanderbilt's response was that since Mrs. Astor had never formally called upon her, they were not formal acquaintances and thus it would be improper to invite her daughter to the ball. Well, this was a brilliant move. For Mrs. Astor, seeing no alternative, swallowed her pride and called upon Mrs. Vanderbilt. The next day, Carrie Astor's invitation to the ball arrived. The Vanderbilts were in. Mrs. Vanderbilt's Big Bash was a costume ball, and she invited 1,000 of New York's wealthiest citizens to attend. And they responded with ingenuity and enthusiasm, spending lavishly on their costumes. Some of them came dressed as animals and others as figures from history or literature, but the most popular theme by far was to dress as European royalty, like Louis XIV, Marie Antoinette, and many more. Now, building palaces on Fifth Avenue and dressing up as European royalty signaled a major shift in American political culture. Ever since the American Revolution, American political culture focused obsessively on the need to adhere to Republican values and to shun anything that suggested monarchy or aristocracy. These Republican values stressed egalitarianism, which explains why Americans in the early 19th century stopped bowing to each other and instead adopted the handshake. Americans also shunned ostentatious displays of wealth and status, valuing instead Republican modesty and restraint. For example, the richest people in New York City in the 1830s lived in a nice little neighborhood called Gramercy Park. And if you walked around it today, you'd be struck by the modest style of the homes of the rich that still stand there. They're nice, but they're not opulent. And Republican values also permeated American politics, where one of the worst things one could say about one's adversary is that they harbored aspirations to be a king or an aristocrat, rather than a man of the people. So clearly something had changed by the 1880s. America's super-rich families had tossed aside ideas like restraint and modesty and went all in on aping their European counterparts, working self-consciously to transform themselves into a new American aristocracy. The modest homes of the 1830s rich, just a few miles downtown in Gramercy Park, looked like tool sheds compared to the palatial mansions being built on Fifth Avenue, a place now nicknamed Millionaire's Mile. And this was happening in every major American city, where rows of monumental homes were rising in places like Nob Hill in San Francisco, Lakeshore Drive in Chicago, and the Main Line in Philadelphia. When the Vanderbilt Ball took place on March 26, 1883, yet another indication that a new era had dawned became obvious as thousands of everyday New Yorkers gathered on the sidewalks to watch the spectacle. The rich had become celebrities for being rich. Mrs. Vanderbilt had skillfully cultivated media coverage, providing interviews and inviting reporters in to see preparations for the big night, and the media lapped it up. By the early 1880s, most major newspapers had added what they called society pages that chronicled in breathless detail the European tours of the Belmonts and Astors and Lodges, the impending weddings of Morgans to the Satterleys, and the Vanderbilts to the Whitneys, the scandals of high society, the usual things like affairs, divorces, bankruptcies, and suicides also received intense media coverage. Basically, you can draw a straight line from this moment in American history right to the Kardashians. Dancing at the ball began at 11 p.m., and dinner, catered by the famous Delmonico's restaurant, was served at 2 a.m., and the event finally concluded as the sun was rising. Some of the press coverage the next day was a little scornful about the excess, but most offered giddy descriptions of the guests, the costumes, and the festivities. Mrs. Vanderbilt had vaulted to the upper echelons of New York society. As the kids say these days, she crushed it. The success of the Vanderbilt Ball inspired other elite families to engage in a competition to see who could outdo everyone in terms of extravagant spending on balls, soirees, parties, and weddings. They also built even bigger mansions in summer resort areas like Newport, Rhode Island. It probably won't surprise you that it was in this era that the term conspicuous consumption was coined by a sociologist named Thursten Veblen. Conspicuous consumption of valuable goods, he wrote, is a means of reputability to the gentleman of leisure. And by the way, keep an eye out for a new television series coming to HBO this fall. It's called The Gilded Age, and it's the creation of Julian Fellowes, the guy who created Downton Abbey. It's essentially a Downton Abbey of an earlier era and set in New York rather than the UK. My bet is it's going to be a huge hit, and you better believe it will feature many of the themes discussed in this piece. I, for one, can't wait. In fact, I'm probably going to start a Gilded Age fan podcast, but more on that later. So what else of note happened this week in U.S. history? March 25th, 1911, a fire broke out in a garment factory in New York City. The flames spread rapidly, and because the owners of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory had locked the doors, many of the hundreds of mostly Jewish and Italian women were trapped. Many of them jumped to their deaths from the windows high above the sidewalks, as horrified spectators watched. In all, 146 people, mostly young women, died in the tragedy. The incident provoked outrage among workers and social reformers and led to the passage of many factory safety laws that were eventually copied in other states. March 25, 1957, U.S. Customs agents seize 520 copies of Allen Ginsberg's poem, Howl. Because the poem contained references to sex and drugs, Ginsberg was unable to get it published in the United States, so he had it published in England and shipped to the United States. But the government deemed it obscene and seized the books on their arrival. This incident, A, brought a lot of attention to this poem, and B, led to a landmark obscenity trial in which a judge ultimately ruled that the poem was not obscene. March 27, 1915, a woman named Mary Mallon is sent into quarantine. She had been identified as a carrier of typhoid fever who had infected a large number of people while working as a cook for wealthy families. You probably know her as Typhoid Mary. She had been forcibly quarantined a few years earlier and gained release only by promising never to work as a cook again. But as a poor Irish immigrant, she had no other skills and soon took up cooking again and infecting people. When she was discovered a second time, she was arrested and sent into quarantine on a small island off of Manhattan. And she stayed there for the rest of her life, 23 years, unable to leave. Other important events this week: March 23, 1925, the state of Tennessee prohibited the teaching of evolution, setting up the drama that would be called the Monkey Trial. March 27, 1939, the NCAA crowned its first national basketball champion, the University of Oregon. March 28, 1834, Congress censured President Andrew Jackson for his actions related to the fight over the Bank of the United States. And what notable people were born this week? March 24, 1834, soldier, geologist, and explorer of the American West, John Wesley Powell was born in Mount Morris, New York. Powell served in the Union Army during the Civil War and lost his right arm at the Battle of Shiloh. After the war, he pursued his deep interest in geology and botany. He earned national acclaim in 1869 when he led a 99-day expedition down the uncharted waters of the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon. He later went on to direct the U.S. Geological Survey, where he presciently warned of the coming need to conserve water in the western states as they developed. Unfortunately, Powell also gave voice to theories of Native American inferiority that shaped American Indian policy. Of his journey down the Colorado River, John Wesley Powell wrote this in his journal: "The wonders of the Grand Canyon cannot be adequately represented in symbols of speech, nor by speech itself. The resources of the graphic arts are taxed beyond their powers in attempting to portray its features. Language and illustration combined must fail." March 24, 1919, poet Lawrence Ferlinghetti was born in Bronxville, New York. Ferlinghetti became famous in the 1950s with the publication of his first collection of poems, A Coney Island of the Mind. He later opened City Lights in San Francisco, one of the nation's legendary bookstores. In fact, Ferlinghetti and City Lights were involved in Allen Ginsberg's obscenity trial. And here's another fun fact. I got to meet Lawrence Ferlinghetti way back in the 1990s. He was delightful. And he's still alive at age 101. March 25, 1934, Gloria Steinem was born in Toledo, Ohio. Steinem emerged in the 1960s as a leading figure in what is now termed second-wave feminism. As a writer and political activist on behalf of women's liberation, she co-founded Ms. Magazine, testified many times before Congress, and helped establish many organizations dedicated to increasing women's political power. And at age 85, she's still at it. Gloria Steinem once said, "We'll never solve the feminization of power until we solve the masculinity of wealth." Also born this week, March 25, 1925, writer Flannery O'Connor. March 26, 1911, playwright Tennessee Williams. And March 29, 1790, President John Tyler. Okay, time for the last word. Let's give it to Lawrence Ferlinghetti, who was born 101 years ago this week. Here's a poem he wrote in 2007, as the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan raged. It's called Pity the Nation. Pity the nation whose people are sheep, and whose shepherds mislead them. Pity the nation whose leaders are liars, whose sages are silenced, and whose bigots haunt the airwaves. Pity the nation that raises not its voice, except to praise conquerors and acclaim the bully as hero, and aims to rule the world with force and by torture. Pity the nation that knows no other language but its own, and no other culture but its own. Pity the nation whose breath is money, and sleeps the sleep of the too well-fed. Pity the nation, oh pity the people, who allow their rights to erode and their freedoms to be washed away. My country, tears of thee, sweet land of liberty. Well, that's going to do it for In the Past Lane this week. You can learn more about me and everything we talked about at inthepastlane.com. And let's interact via social media. I'm at In the Past Lane on both Twitter and Instagram, and our Facebook page is In the Past Lane Podcast. See you next week.
SBI, Snoring Beagle International.